Imagine a monster. It is half a mile wide. It weighs millions of tons. It is spinning at speeds that physics suggests should not be possible on the surface of the Earth. Now, imagine you are standing directly in its path. But here is the problem. You don't know it's there. You have no iPhone in your pocket to scream an emergency alert. You have no sirens wailing across the city. You have no Doppler radar showing a red hook echo on a television screen. You are standing in a 5-story brick building, a fortress of industry, and you believe, truly believe, that it is the safest place on Earth. You are wrong. In 1903, a storm didn't just hit a city. It deleted the future of an entire generation. On April 1st, 1903, the residents of Gainesville, Georgia, thought the sky was playing a joke on them. It was April Fool's Day. After all, pranks were common, laughter was common, but within 60 seconds the joke turned into one of the deadliest meteorological events in American history. It wasn't just the wind that killed them. It was where they were hiding. This is not just a story about weather. This is a story about a trap made of brick, steel, and hubris that claimed over 100 lives in a single, terrifying heartbeat. Welcome to Gainesville, and welcome to the year the sky fell. The year is 1903. To understand why this tragedy was so absolute, you have to understand the world these people lived in. This was the era of the New South. The Civil War was a fading memory, replaced by the roar of steam engines and the clatter of industry. And nowhere was booming quite like Gainesville, Georgia. It was a town on the rise, a town of ambition, and the beating heart of that ambition was cotton. If you were to walk down the streets of Gainesville on the morning of April 1st, you wouldn't hear birds, you wouldn't hear the wind in the trees, you would hear the hum, a low, constant rhythmic vibration that shook the dirt beneath your boots. It was the sound of the mills. The Gainesville Cotton Mill was the pride of the county. It was a massive structure, a testament to man's dominance over nature. It stood 5 stories tall, built of solid red brick. It was designed to house tens of thousands of spindles, massive machines that spun raw white cotton into the fabric that clothed the world. Inside that mill, the noise was deafening. Clack, 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 clack. Thousands of looms slamming back and forth, hundreds of times a minute. If you worked inside the Gainesville mill, you didn't talk. You couldn't. You communicated with hand signals. You learned to read lips. The noise was so absolute that it became a physical weight, pressing against your eardrums, isolating you from the world outside. And that isolation is exactly what the storm was waiting for. Most of the workers were women and children, young girls, some as young as 10 or 11 years old, named Mary or Sarah or Elizabeth. They stood barefoot on the oily wooden floors, tending to the machines. They were lintheads, a derogatory term used by the upper class, but worn with a strange sort of pride by the workers. It came from the fine white dust that filled the air, settling on their hair, their eyelashes, their clothes, until they looked like ghosts. They worked 12-hour shifts. They were paid pennies. And on this specific morning, April 1st, the air inside the mill felt different. It wasn't just the dust. It was the heat. April in Georgia is usually mild, pleasant. But on this day, the temperature had spiked. It was oppressive, sticky. The kind of humidity that makes your clothes cling to your skin and makes the air feel thick, hard to breathe. Inside the mill, with the friction of thousands of machines, the temperature was soaring. Sweat dripped down the faces of the weavers. The windows were cracked open, hoping to catch a breeze, but there was no breeze. Outside, the sky was a bruised, sickly white. The old-timers, the farmers, who came into town to sell their produce. They noticed it first. They felt it in their joints, that deep, aching throb in the knees and elbows that signaled a pressure drop. They looked up at the sky and saw the clouds moving in strange, conflicting directions. But inside the mill, inside the brick fortress, there was only the work. Clack, 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 clack. They couldn't see the sky. They couldn't feel the pressure drop. And most importantly, they couldn't hear what was coming. To understand the horror of 1903, we have to strip away the safety net of the 21st century. Today, If a supercell thunderstorm forms over Mississippi and starts tracking toward Georgia, we know about it hours in advance. We have satellites in geostationary orbit. We have computer models running billions of calculations per second. We have a meteorologist on every TV channel pointing at a map, drawing a red polygon, and telling you exactly when to take cover. In 1903, weather forecasting was little more than educated guesswork. The United States Weather Bureau did exist. They had telegraph lines connecting stations across the country. But their ability to predict a tornado, it was non-existent. In fact, the word tornado was actually banned from official forecasts. The government believed that using the word would cause panic. They thought that panic was more dangerous than the wind itself. So, even if they suspected a storm was capable of producing a twister, they would simply forecast high winds or severe local storms. On the morning of April 1st, the forecast for Gainesville was disturbing in its banality. Fair to cloudy, chance of showers. That was it. That was the only warning these people had. Imagine the level of vulnerability. You are walking blindfolded through a minefield, and the only person who can see the mines isn't allowed to tell you they are there. So, life went on. The shopkeepers on the square opened their doors. The lawyers in the courthouse filed their papers. And the children. Oh, the children. It was April Fool's Day. The mood in the town was light, mischievous. Boys tied strings to wallets and left them on the sidewalk, yanking them away when someone tried to pick them up. Girls pinned "Kick Me" signs on each other's backs. There was laughter. There was a sense of playfulness. If someone ran into the general store and yelled, "There's a storm coming! Run for your lives!" the reaction wouldn't be fear. It would be a chuckle. Good one, Eager, you almost got me. This psychological state is crucial. It's known as normalcy bias. When we are faced with a threat that is too terrible to comprehend, especially on a day dedicated to pranks, our brains simply reject the information. We rewrite reality to fit what we expect to see. We expect safety. We expect the sun to set. We expect to go home for dinner. The people of Gainesville were suffering from a fatal case of normalcy bias, and while they laughed, the atmosphere above Alabama and Georgia was cooking up a chemical reaction of pure violence. Okay, back to the mill. We need to talk about the building itself. The Gainesville Cotton Mill was not just a factory. It was a marvel of engineering, or so they thought. It was built in 1901, just 2 years before the storm. It was brand new. It was modern. It was designed by arguably the best industrial architects in the South. It was a long, rectangular box, 5 stories high, with massive windows to let in natural light for the weavers. The walls were made of triple-thick brick. The beams were solid heart pine, incredibly strong, incredibly heavy. But there was a flaw, a hidden, structural flaw. To maximize efficiency, the architects needed a water supply for the fire sprinkler system. Fires were a constant risk in cotton mills. The lint was highly flammable. A single spark could turn the whole building into an inferno. So, a sprinkler system was mandatory, and that system needed gravity to work. So, they built a water tower, but they didn't build it on a separate steel derrick next to the mill, as you might see today. No, to save money and to streamline the design, they built the water tank directly into the building. It was a massive cylindrical steel tank, holding tens of thousands of gallons of water. It weighed immense amounts. And where did they put it? They placed it on the rear tower of the mill, directly above the stairwell, directly above the restrooms, directly above the frantic activity of the workforce. Think about the physics of that. You have a massive fluid weight, perched high above the ground, supported by masonry walls. Masonry, brick and mortar, is fantastic at handling compression. It can hold up a lot of weight if that weight is pressing straight down. But brick is terrible, absolutely terrible, at handling shear force, lateral force, sideways force. If you push a stack of bricks from the side, it doesn't bend, it doesn't flex, it snaps, it crumbles. The Gainesville Cotton Mill was a house of cards, holding a bowling ball on the very top card. And the wind was about to deal the hand. The morning drags on. 10 a.m., 11 a.m., the heat is getting worse. In the weather logs from the day, observers noted a strange phenomenon. The air felt electric. This isn't a metaphor. The static electricity in the air was so intense that horses in the livery stables were spooking, kicking at their stalls. People reported that their hair felt like it was trying to stand up on its own. This happens when a massive thunderstorm complex, a supercell, is building up a charge. The friction of ice crystals swirling inside the clouds generates millions of volts of potential energy. The atmosphere becomes a battery, waiting to discharge. At 11:30 a.m., the first signs appear to the southwest, over the horizon. The sky begins to change color. It doesn't turn gray. It doesn't turn black. It turns green, a deep, mossy, sickly olive green. This is a color that triggers a primal instinct in the human brain. We are not meant to see a green sky. It signals that the sunlight is being refracted through massive amounts of hail the size of baseballs, suspended in the updraft of a monster storm. But remember the mill, remember the noise, clack, 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 clack. The workers inside cannot see the horizon. They are focused on the threads. They are focused on the quotas. If they stop the loom, they lose money. If they lose money, they don't eat. So they keep their heads down. 12 p.m., noon. The lunch whistle blows. This is a critical moment, a moment of sliding doors. For some workers, this whistle is their salvation. They grab their tin pails and walk out into the humid air. They head home to nearby cottages for a quick meal. They move away from the target zone. But for others, for many others, the lunch break is a time to rest inside the cool shadows of the mill. Or, more dangerously, they congregate. They gather in groups. They sit on the loading docks. They chat in the stairwells. The stairwells. Remember where the water tower is? It is directly above the rear tower, the main stairwell. Dozens of workers gather there. It's a social hub. They are laughing. They are trading April Fool's jokes. They are sharing sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. They are sitting directly underneath the bowling ball. 12:15 p.m. The storm is now visible from the outskirts of town. And it is not just one storm. This is the detail that makes the Gainesville tragedy so scientifically fascinating and so horrific. Witnesses to the southwest described seeing two distinct dark masses. One storm cell was moving in from the west. Another storm cell was driving up from the south. In meteorology, when two storm cells interact, it can lead to something called the Fujiwara effect, or simply a cell merger. It is a moment of chaotic turbulence. The updrafts combine. The rotation intensifies. The energy of two systems is focused into a single point. It is like pouring gasoline on a bonfire. At 12:20 p.m., the two clouds collide. The result is instant. A funnel drops. It is wide. It is jagged. It is not the smooth, slender rope you see in movies like The Wizard of Oz. This is a wedge, a stovepipe on steroids. It is a wall of rotating debris that consumes everything it touches. It touches down in a grove of trees southwest of the city. Trees shatter, not break, shatter. They explode into splinters, turning into millions of wooden missiles. The sound begins. Survivors of tornadoes often say it sounds like a freight train. That is the cliché. But the survivors of Gainesville, the ones who lived long enough to speak, said that wasn't quite right. A freight train has a rhythm. Chug, chug, chug. This sound had no rhythm. It was a continuous, screaming roar, like 1,000 waterfalls crashing onto a tin roof. It was a sound that vibrated the chest cavity, a sound that you felt before you heard. 12:30 p.m. The monster is on the ground. It is moving fast, 30, maybe 40 miles per hour. It is hungry. It tears through the New Holland district. This is a separate mill village, slightly to the north. It rips roofs off cottages. It tosses wagons through the air. But it is just a glancing blow. The main funnel, the core of the vortex, misses the New Holland mill. The residents there look up in terror, seeing the beast pass them by. They think, "Thank God, it missed us." They breathe a sigh of relief, but storms do not travel in straight lines. They wobble. They drift. And this monster, having spared New Holland, pivots. It turns its dark rotating eye toward the south, toward the valley, toward the Gainesville Cotton Mill. 12:35 p.m. Inside the mill, the lunch break is ending. The whistle blows again. Back to work. The workers who were outside start filing back in. The workers who were inside stand up, brushing crumbs from their laps. The looms start up again. Clack, 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 clack. The noise returns, the wall of sound. But then, something happens that pierces even the deafening roar of the machinery. The lights flicker. Once, twice, then, darkness. The power is cut. The massive belts that drive the looms begin to slow down. The hum drops in pitch, dragging down into a low, mechanical groan. Ooh. Silence. For the first time all day, the mill is silent. The workers look at each other. Confusion. What happened? Is the generator down? Is this a prank? Did the foreman cut the power for April Fools? Someone laughs nervously. Hey, who turned out the lights? But then, in the sudden silence of the factory floor, they hear it. Outside the thick brick walls, a rumble. It's getting louder. The floorboards begin to tremble. Not the rhythmic shaking of the looms, but a frantic, chaotic vibration. Dust starts to shake loose from the ceiling rafters, drifting down like snow. A manager walks to one of the large windows on the western wall. He wipes the condensation from the glass. He peers out into the gloom. He expects to see rain. He expects to see a thunderstorm. Instead, he sees the end of the world. A wall of black spinning earth is less than 400 yards away. It is filling the entire window. It is eating the sky. He turns back to the room. He opens his mouth to scream, to tell them to run, to tell them to get away from the windows. But the roar is already here. The glass begins to bow inward. The pressure inside the room drops so sharply that people's ears pop painfully. The air is suddenly sucked out of the room, pulling the breath from their lungs. It is 12:45 p.m. The trap is set. The victims are inside, the door is locked, and the monster is knocking. 12:45 p.m. The glass doesn't just break, it atomizes. Imagine standing in front of a shotgun blast made of hail and gravel. That is what hits the western wall of the Gainesville Cotton Mill. Crash. Thousands of panes of glass explode inward simultaneously. The sound is not like breaking a cup in your kitchen. It is a sonic boom of shattering silica. In an instant, the air inside the mill turns into a weapon. The shards of glass mix with the millions of cotton fibers floating in the air. The lint that gave the workers their nickname suddenly becomes a blinding, choking blizzard of white needles. The manager, the one standing by the window, is gone. He doesn't fall. He is simply erased. The vacuum pressure of the vortex sucks him out of the building before his brain can even process the pain. For the hundreds of workers inside, the women, the children, the men, the world dissolves into chaos. It is loud. It is impossibly loud. Survivors later said they didn't scream, not because they weren't terrified, but because they couldn't hear themselves. You could be screaming at the top of your lungs, causing your throat to bleed, and you wouldn't hear a single note over the roar of the wind. The wind enters the third and fourth floors at 200 miles per hour. Heavy iron looms, machines that weigh as much as a small car, are tossed across the room like toys. They slide across the oily floor, sparking and screeching, crushing anything in their path. People are diving under the machinery. Get down! Get down! But there is nowhere to go. The wind is circling inside the room. It creates a centrifuge of debris, wooden bobbins, steel shuttles, bricks, glass. It's all spinning. And then, the physics of the building begins to fail. Let's pause the chaos for 1 microsecond to look at the engineering. This is critical. A tornado is essentially a giant vacuum cleaner. It has extremely low pressure at its core. When it moves over a building, the pressure outside drops instantly, but the pressure inside the building is still high. The air inside wants to get out. It expands, explosively. The Gainesville mill starts to breathe. The walls bow out. The roof, the massive timber roof, lifts just a few inches. Up, Then, slam, down, up, down. The building is hyperventilating. The mortar between the bricks begins to turn to dust. The structural integrity is vanishing. But remember the trap. Remember the flaw. The water tower. The 20,000-gallon steel tank perched on the rear tower. As the building shakes, as the walls vibrate with the force of 1,000 freight trains, the supports holding that tank begin to groan. Screech! That is the sound of steel shearing, the workers huddled in the stairwell, the ones who thought they were safe. They look up. They see the ceiling above them cracking, splintering, white dust pouring down in streams. They don't see the wind. They see the roof coming down. And then, gravity takes over. Snap. The supports give way. The tank, weighing hundreds of thousands of pounds, drops. It crashes through the roof of the 5th floor. Boom! But it doesn't stop. The floor of the 5th story wasn't designed to catch a falling ocean. The beams snap like toothpicks. The tank crashes through the 4th floor. Boom! The 3rd floor. Boom! The 2nd floor. Boom! It is a cascading failure. A pancake collapse. The tank acts like a piston, driving everything, and everyone, down into the basement. The stairwell, that social hub where the workers were eating their lunch, is obliterated. In 3 seconds, 5 stories of brick, steel, and humanity are compressed into a pile of rubble less than 20 feet high. The noise of the collapse is so intense it registers as an earthquake on seismographs miles away. And then, the rest of the building follows. The tornado wraps its arms around the weakened structure. The top 2 floors of the main mill disintegrate. Bricks are stripped away layer by layer. The roof peels back like the lid of a sardine can and is flung into the forest half a mile away. Inside the remaining shell, it is hell. Let's focus on one person, just one. To understand the scale, we have to look at the individual. Let's call him Thomas. He is 12 years old. He was a doffer. His job was to replace the full bobbins with empty ones. When the glass blew out, Thomas dove under a spinning frame. He curled into a ball. He covered his head with his hands. He felt the floor drop. He felt the sensation of falling, a lurch in his stomach, followed by a violent impact. Then, weight. Heavy, crushing weight. A beam had fallen across the machine he was hiding under. The machine held the weight up, just barely. It created a small, triangular pocket of air, a void. Thomas is alive, but he is trapped in pitch blackness. The air is thick with dust. He coughs, choking on the pulverized brick. He tries to move his legs, but he is pinned. He can't see anything, but he can hear. The roar of the wind is moving away now. It is fading, moving off to the northeast toward New Holland, but the sound is replaced by something worse. The sound of the wreckage settling. Creak, groan. The building is still moving. It's unstable. Every few seconds, a loose brick falls. A beam shifts, and then, the voices. At first, it's just a murmur, a low collective moan rising from the darkness. Help! Mama, I can't breathe. Then, the screaming starts. It comes from everywhere, above him, below him, beside him. It is a chorus of agony. People trapped under tons of masonry, people pinned by machines. Thomas closes his eyes in the dark. He is shaking. He is covered in dust and blood. He thinks the worst is over. He thinks he just has to wait for someone to dig him out. He is wrong, because the storm has one more cruel trick to play. The debris, the twisted wreckage of the mill, contains danger. The mill was powered by steam. It was lit by oil lamps in some places, and the workers, to keep warm or to heat their lunches, used wood-burning stoves. When the floors collapsed, those stoves were thrown into the pile, live coals, burning embers, scattered into a mixture of splintered dry pine, cotton lint, and oil. Cotton lint is explosive. It burns hot and fast. Somewhere in the darkness, deep in the rubble, a spark catches. A small flame flickers to life. Thomas smells it before he sees it. Smoke, acrid, black, choking smoke, panic. Panic is a cold thing, but this panic is hot. The survivors trapped in the ruins realize what is happening. The pile is catching fire. Fire! Fire! The screams change pitch. They go from cries of pain to cries of pure terror. Imagine being unable to move. You are pinned under a beam, and you can smell the smoke getting closer. You can feel the heat rising from the floorboards beneath you. It is the ultimate nightmare. The fire and flood scenario. Wait, flood? Yes. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and it loves irony. As the fire begins to lick at the edges of the ruins, the sky opens up. The tornado has passed, but the parent storm is still overhead, and it dumps rain. Not a drizzle, a deluge, freezing cold rain, mixed with hail. The water pours down into the open wound of the building. It rushes into the basement where the water tank drove the victims. The basement where the survivors are huddled in the lowest pockets. The water begins to rise. So now, you have a choice. Do you burn, or do you drown? The rescuers, the townspeople who are running toward the mill from the town square, they see a scene that looks like a medieval painting of hell. Smoke is rising from the jagged stump of the mill. Flames are shooting up from the debris, and the rain is hissing on the hot bricks. Steam, smoke, rain, blood. The rescuers are frantic. They don't have heavy machinery. They don't have cranes. They don't have the jaws of life. They have their hands. They rush to the pile. They start pulling at the bricks. They are crying, screaming names. Elizabeth, John, Sarah. They burn their hands on the hot metal. They slip on the wet, oily bricks, but they dig. They find a hand sticking out of the rubble. They pull. It's a young woman. She is alive. She is coughing up black soot. They drag her out, laying her on the wet grass. "There's more," she gasps. "There's so many more." They go back in, but for every person they save, they find two who are beyond saving. They find bodies so crushed they cannot be identified. They find bodies that have been altered by the wind. The wind at F4 intensity does strange things to the human body. It drives straw into telephone poles. It strips the bark off trees. And it can drive splinters of wood deep into skin. The doctors who arrive on the scene are overwhelmed instantly. They set up a triage center on the lawn. In the rain, there are no sterile fields. There is no anesthesia. There are just saws and bandages and whiskey. The moans of the dying mix with the hiss of the rain. Let's go back to Thomas, the boy in the void. He smells the smoke. He feels the water rising around his ankles. It is freezing cold. He screams, "I'm here! I'm down here!" Above him, he hears a voice, a man's voice. "Hush now! I hear something!" Scrabbling sounds, bricks moving. A shaft of gray light pierces the darkness. A hand reaches down. "Grab hold, son!" Thomas reaches up. His fingers brush the man's hand. He is pulled up. Through the jagged hole, through the smoke. He breaks the surface. He takes a breath of fresh air. It tastes like ozone and wet ash. He looks around, and he stops. His brain cannot process the image. An hour ago. This was a 5-story building. It was a fortress. It was his whole world. Now, it is a mound. A smoking, steaming mound of red clay and brick. The water tower, that massive steel killer, is lying on its side in the wreckage, crumpled like a paper cup. He looks at the town beyond. The destruction is absolute. Houses are gone. Trees are stripped bare. But it's the silence that hits him. The wind has stopped. The roar is gone. The rain is tapping gently on the debris. Tap, tap, tap. And under that tapping, the soft, rhythmic sobbing of the survivors. It is 1 p.m. The storm lasted less than 5 minutes. But Gainesville, the queen city of the mountains, is dead. The survivors stand in the rain, shivering, looking at the sky, waiting for it to apologize. But the sky is just gray, empty, indifferent. Everything is wet, everything is cold, everything is broken, and it is quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The silence didn't last long. By 2 p.m., the shock was wearing off, and the reality of the logistics was setting in. Gainesville was a small town. It had a few doctors, it had limited supplies, it had a finite amount of morphine, and it had hundreds, literally hundreds of people with catastrophic injuries, crushed limbs, punctured lungs, severe burns from the mill fire, head trauma. The local hospital was not a hospital in the modern sense. It was a triage tent in the mud. The doctors were sewing up wounds with sewing needles. They were using door frames as stretchers. They realized quickly, if these people stayed in Gainesville, they would die. They needed Atlanta. Atlanta was 50 miles away. In 1903, that was a journey, but there was a railroad. And so began one of the most harrowing chapters of the disaster, the death train. A special train was commandeered. Every available passenger car, box car, and flatbed was hooked up to a steam engine. They loaded the victims. Imagine that scene. There were no gurneys. They laid the injured on the floor. They laid them on the seats. They stacked them. The train was a rolling tube of agony as it pulled out of the station, chugging south toward Atlanta. The sound inside the cars was described as a low, continuous wail. There were no pain management drips. There was just whiskey and prayer. The train engineer, a man who knew he was carrying a cargo of dying souls, pushed the engine to its limit. He drove that train faster than it was ever designed to go. He risked derailing the entire thing to save minutes. When they arrived in Atlanta, the city was waiting. News had traveled by telegraph. Gainesville destroyed, 100 dead, send help. Crowds gathered at the station, not to gawk, but to help. Strangers lined up with wagons and carriages to transport the injured to Grady Hospital. It was a moment of profound humanity in the face of inhuman cruelty. Back in Gainesville, the sun began to set. Nightfall is the enemy of the rescuer. In 1903, there were no floodlights, no portable generators. They worked by the light of kerosene lanterns and torches. The ruins of the mill were still smoking. The fires had been mostly extinguished by the rain, but the heat radiated from the pile like an oven. Men dug until their fingers bled. They were looking for the voids, the air pockets. They found a man named J.B. He was trapped under a pile of bricks 4 feet deep. He had been there for 6 hours. When they pulled him out, he wasn't crying, he wasn't screaming, he was singing. He was singing a hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee." He was in shock, his mind had snapped, but he was alive. April the 2nd, the next morning. The sun rose over a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The count began. The bodies were laid out in the opera house and the courthouse, rows of them, covered in white sheets. Families walked down the rows, lifting a sheet, looking, crying, moving to the next one. It was a lottery of grief. The final official death toll was listed at 98. But historian and the locals knew that was a lie. The African American community, which was hit hard in the outskirts, was often undercounted in 1903. The records were poor, the lintheads in the mill, the transient workers. Many of them had no family to claim them. The real number was likely well over 150, but the statistic that haunted everyone, the number that made people sick to their stomachs, was this. Of the confirmed dead, over 70 died in the Gainesville Cotton Mill. 70 people in one building. Why? This brings us to the investigation. The why. This is the part of the story where we have to put on our detective hats. Because this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was an industrial homicide. So, let's look at the blueprints. In the weeks following the disaster, engineers and architects descended on the mill. They walked the ruins. They looked at the debris field. And they all pointed to the same thing. The water tower. The report was damning. It stated that while the brick walls were sufficient for a normal storm, and while the roof was standard for the time, the decision to place a 20,000-gallon fluid mass on the top of a masonry structure was ill-advised. That is polite engineer speak for negligent. The investigation revealed that the tower didn't just fall because the roof collapsed. The tower caused the collapse. The wind load, the lateral force of the tornado, pushed against the tank. The tank acted like a giant sail. It caught the wind. The leverage was immense. It torqued the beams. It twisted the frame, and it shattered the supports. If that water tower had been on the ground, 30 feet away, the roof might have still come off. The windows would have still blown out. But the floors? The floors might have held. The pancake collapse that crushed Thomas's friends, that created the fire trap, that created the basement flood, was almost entirely due to that falling tank. The architects had prioritized cheap plumbing over structural safety. They saved a few $100s on piping, and it cost 70 lives. The lawsuits followed, of course they did. But this was 1903. Worker protections were weak. Most cases were settled for pennies. A grieving mother might get $50 for the loss of her child. The mill was rebuilt. They reused the bricks. They reused the land. But they put the water tower on a steel derrick, outside, on the ground. A grim lesson learned in blood. The city of Gainesville buried its dead. They built monuments. They planted trees. And they tried to forget. They tried to move on. They told themselves it was a freak event. A once-in-a-lifetime tragedy. A curse of the April Fool's weather. They believed lightning doesn't strike twice. They were wrong. And this is where the story turns from a tragedy into a legend. A dark legend. Fast forward. 33 years. April 1936. A new generation is living in Gainesville. The children who survived the 1903 storm are now adults. They are parents. The town has grown. It is modern. It has a beautiful town square. And on the morning of April 6, 1936, the sky turns green again. It sounds like a horror movie script, but it is historical fact. The atmospheric conditions over Georgia set up in an almost identical pattern to 1903. A low-pressure system, high humidity, a volatile mix. At 8:27 a.m., a massive tornado touches down, and it doesn't just hit the outskirts. It doesn't just hit the mill. It hits the town square. It hits the Cooper Pants factory. It hits the department stores. It hits the courthouse. It is an F4, possibly an F5. It is even stronger than the 1903 storm, and the devastation is ungodly. 203 people die in minutes. It remains the fifth deadliest tornado in United States history. The eerie parallels are impossible to ignore. In 1903, the Cooper Pants factory was just a small operation. In 1936, it was a major employer. And just like the cotton mill, it collapsed. It caught fire. Workers were trapped in the basement while the building burned above them. The exact same nightmare repeating itself. There is a man named Cooper Green, no relation to the factory. He was a boy in 1903. He remembered the storm. He remembered the sound. In 1936, he was the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, but he had ties to the area. He often spoke about the curse of Gainesville. People started to whisper, "Is this town cursed? Is the geography a trap?" Meteorologists today will tell you, there is no curse. Tornadoes don't have memories, but topography matters. Gainesville sits at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is in a location where warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico is often forced up over the terrain. It creates a natural lift zone. It is a highway for storms. The people of 1903 didn't know that. They just knew the wind. But the legacy of these two storms, the twin disasters of Gainesville, is what saved us. Because of 1903, and specifically because of 1936, the government finally woke up. Engineers began to write the first serious building codes regarding wind load. They realized that brick buildings, unreinforced masonry, were death traps. They stopped building water towers on roofs. They started bolting houses to foundations. And, most importantly, they started looking at the science of warning. After 1936, the push for a severe weather warning system began in earnest. It would take decades to get radar, but the seed was planted in the rubble of Gainesville. The tornado word ban was eventually lifted. They realized that fear was better than death. So, where is Gainesville today? It is a thriving city. It is the poultry capital of the world. If you go there now, to the site of the old cotton mill, it has been repurposed. It is now the mill at New Holland. It's a mixed-use development. There are lofts, there are offices. It is beautiful. The brick has been cleaned, the windows are new, but if you walk around the back and you look at the ground, you can still see scars in the foundation. And if you go to the center of town, there is a monument. It lists the names of the 1903 victims, the names of the 1936 victims. They are carved in stone: Mary, John, Elizabeth. They are silent now. But their silence speaks louder than the wind ever could. It tells us that civilization is fragile. We build our fortresses, we build our factories, we build our towers, and we think we are the masters of the earth. We think we have conquered nature with our steam engines and our steel beams. But all it takes is a shift in the wind, a collision of air masses, a few degrees of temperature change, and our fortresses turn into tombs. The story of the Gainesville Trap is not just about a tornado. It is about the arrogance of the industrial age. It is about a water tower that was too heavy. It is about a warning that never came. And it is about the boy, Thomas, who was pulled from the darkness into the rain. He lived, he grew up, he had children. And every time the sky turned green, every time the wind started to howl, he would go to the window, and he would listen. He wasn't listening for the rain. He was listening for the freight train. The wind cannot be stopped. We know that now. We cannot fight the sky. But next time, we will be listening.